Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 8th session in our 2020 Franzik PC School Law Conference. My name is Aristolianis, and I'm delighted to welcome you today. For those of you who have been with us for the past 27 years, you know that each year we host an annual conference for clients and friends. We're always thrilled to be in Oak Brook with hundreds of you for sessions on all the school law topics of the day. This year with COVID-19, we're not able to be together physically, but we are excited to use this Thursday noon hour to bring you the sessions we would otherwise present in person. Our conference is being held on Thursdays at noon between October 1st and December 3rd with a break for Thanksgiving. Allow me to introduce my partners, Scott Metcalf and Michael Hernandez. Before we begin, please make sure you register for the final school law conference session on December 3rd at noon. That session is called Are We There Yet? COVID Update. The session will conclude our 2020 school law conference with where we began, an update on all things COVID, education, and in the law. After our December 3rd webinar, we will segue back to weekly COVID webinars beginning on December 10th. And we'll also be rolling out a series of programs on what to expect in the areas of education, employment, and labor law with the incoming Biden administration. Leave it to say that there will be many, many changes. Throughout the program today, please submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. We'll do our best to answer them. And as always, if you have any follow-up questions, we will invite you to discuss these issues further. Contact Michael, Scott, or myself, or any other Franzik attorney. So with that, let's jump right in. I think it's important to sort of start at the beginning. We're talking about property tax assessments and taxes and how to communicate with the public. And a big part of communicating with the public is understanding the whole scheme of property taxation and the appeals process in Illinois. So some of you may have seen this slide before. We've augmented it with the COVID-19 virus because it really is permeating everything that's happening in the assessment field this year. So initially, in any county in Illinois, the assessor makes the initial assessments, notifies property owners what he or she is doing. There's typically an informal review process at the assessor level, except in Cook County where it is a more formalized system. And then in all counties, boards of review have a formalized process to review assessments. This year, it's a little different with COVID-19. All the boards of review that we're familiar with are doing virtual hearings, either via Zoom or by phone. Any change made at the assessor level or at the board of review will always be a no refund situation. It will simply change the size of everybody's slice of the pie, but no refund threat against the school district. Once you cross over, though, past the threshold of the board of review, the options change for taxpayers. So one option is for them to file at the Property Tax Appeal Board. Any recovery there, whether it's a PTAB decision or a settlement, will yield a refund. Another option are the tax objection complaints, TOC. Those are filed in the circuit court. Scott's going to talk a little bit more about that later. And then the third option that people are less familiar with are the certificates of error, or the C of E's. Those are the three assessment option adjustments that could yield a refund. The third category at the bottom are the rate objections, which we'll talk about later. These are a challenge to something about the development of the district's rate, whether the levy was filed on time or the excess accumulation or something along those lines. Those are unique to a particular taxing body rather than applicable to all taxing bodies where a property is located. Let me turn it over to Scott now.
Right, so let's start by putting this in context. You know, the basic question that a lot of people have is, why is real estate important to school districts? Well, most of the property taxes that are collected in the state of Illinois go to school districts. And additionally, a healthy tax base means lower tax rates and probably fewer citizen complaints. So this particular slide shows that statewide, 58% of the $31.8 billion of property taxes that are collected goes to school districts. That percentage is slightly less in Cook County, but in the collar counties, it's up to 66% of all property taxes that are collected that go to school districts. Now, this slide shows where the money comes from for school districts. And this is data that's compiled as part of ISB's statewide report card. And the surprising number here to me is that statewide, only about 60% of the revenue for school districts comes from the property tax. For many of the clients that we work with, it's more like 80% of their resources come from the property tax. But I think what has happened is that evidence-based funding at the state level has increased the state's share of money being provided to school districts. However, due to COVID and the failure of the Fair Tax Amendment to pass, what happens to state revenues going forward is very unclear. And finally, what about all of those refunds that happen after the taxes are collected? These are the forms of property tax appeals that Eris was just talking about: tax objection complaints, certificates of error, and PTAB cases. We submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the Cook County Treasurer's Office and got the past 5 years of refunds from 3 different types of property tax appeals. Now, the interesting things here are that certificate of error refunds increased the most, from $95 million to $142 million. And my theory on why this happened is because so many people were forgetting to file for their homeowners exemptions, because a lot of these are very small refunds. For PTAB refunds, they spiked in 2017, but have come back down since. And again, my theory on this is that PTAB was working through a backlog of cases, and as they churned out decisions, the refunds increased. And finally, the tax objection complaint refunds vary, but it averages out to be about $120 million a year. Now, there are some additional facts about this that I'd like to share. First of all, just the volume of refunds that are processed by the Treasurer's Office every year. 18,800 tax objection complaint refunds were processed by the Treasurer's Office in 2019. There were 28,000 PTAB refunds and 98,000 refunds issued because of certificates of error. So you can see that there is a lot of money that's coming in and out of the Treasurer's Office as a result of these. So Mike, as I started by saying, you know, a healthy tax base is so important to school districts. What is going on with the real estate market these days?
Yeah, let's talk about some trends. And we want to look at some national data, government data, as well as some trends that impact some of the larger taxing properties in our school districts, office buildings, retail department stores, industrial properties. So here's a sector percentage change review. You know, there's a lot of reports that look at this data year over the year, from you know, April to April, for example, or from June to June. But part of that problem in doing that is that you really are getting a skewed view because you're COVID one year and no COVID the previous year. So we think this is a better review of the data. This is actually the first 9 months of this year, of 2020. It includes COVID and what happened during the year, but it also includes the recovery and what's been going on. And so non-store retail trade is up. Of course, you know, that's mostly what you think it is, the Amazons, the Etsy's, and others. There are a number of retail department stores that have gotten into this business, and we'll talk a little about that trend. Grocery stores, again, up. Why is that? Is it because people are working from home? They're not out here, for example, many in the Loop, many of the stores here for luncheon stores are closed up right now, boarded up. It's not just that. It's not just that people are working from home and so buying groceries to make lunch at home. Rather, this was spiked by the binge buying that occurred early on during the pandemic. And you're seeing that binge buying again. But the bottom line is the grocery stores are up. Clothing and accessories, it's down. This is what you'd expect, right? Because people are not buying new suits. People are not buying more formal accessories to go to work at the office at. Furniture and home stores, down. although people may be doing some fix-ups at the house, they're not really buying a lot of new furniture at this time. So why don't we look at the next slide and talk a little about what impact is this having on these sectors that we talked about. Let's look at a national report from Deloitte. Deloitte, as we all know, is the global financial advisor as well as management advisor in the sector. They had an interesting report. They refer to it as the Retail Evolution's Great Acceleration. And what's the focus of this report? That is that before COVID, the convenience trend, and that's, a lot of that is the online buying as well as the pickup, outside pickup and delivery. That's where we were heading. And that was really being dominated by players outside the industry. And as we indicated, the Etsy's, the eBay, and the Amazons. When the crisis hit, this required a rapid rollout. What they refer to this as is BOPIS. And that is the convenience and that where you could buy online, you could pick up in stores, you could do curbside, you could do delivery. And those retailers that were ready for this or had the ability to convert from this stayed successful. For example, Target has emerged into the top 10 as one of the BOPIS participants. Big players like Walmart, Costco, they're not standing aside and letting the Amazons take all the business. What's the main reason that the consumer identified for this convenience that they're looking for? It's safety. That's what the problem was. So with the vaccine on the horizon, this trend may be changing. But again, this retail impact is important to our school districts because of the ability to receive the property tax payments. Let's look a little more at the retail trends so we can understand what happened during this past year. Although we understand the issue of bankruptcies was upon us at one time, it was accelerated by the pandemic. These are all 2020 bankruptcies. Neiman Marcus, May of 2020. JCPenney, May of 2020. Pier 1, February of 2020. Art Van, March of 2020. What does this mean for the malls that are major players in the property tax area for a number of our school districts? Well, here's what we're seeing. 40% of the national retailers, they skipped their May rent payment. That's not good. 68%, they skipped the June payment. That's not good. And so obviously those are, many of those are the retailers that weren't ready to adjust or had to do some layoffs. And so that's putting a lot of pressure on their attorneys to file property tax assessment claims and large claims we're seeing. For those bankruptcies, for the stores that have closed, the Carsons and others, repurposing of the malls is what's happening. We're seeing doctors' offices. We're seeing apartment buildings being repurposed or other space just being repurposed for other activities, and the downsizing of the big stores. So the market is reacting to try to salvage the value of these properties. Why don't we look at the industrial market? Has that been hit as hard? Not really as much. It's been impacted, but not as much. Online shopping means you need more distribution facilities. So the industrial market has been there to satisfy that. That's lessened the impact on them. Reliance on technology increases data centers. In the past, we would see these AT&T switching stations, and we didn't know what to do with those properties. AT&T didn't know what to do with those properties when they abandoned them. Well, many of those, as well as other warehouse facilities, are being used for data centers. The expansion of the medical marijuana program here in Illinois and elsewhere to the recreational industry requires additional distribution facilities and indoor cultivation centers. Also, what you see use for are these logistics companies that will use these industrial centers to ship and to hold material for short term. So again, less impact on your industrial, less of the large refund requests you're going to see from this industry. What about the next industry? Office space. This is a challenge. We started to reopen. Now they're talking about closing down again. So it does create this uncertainty. Forbes magazine's article, the headline screams, "The Great 2020 Rent Strike." We've seen different moratoriums on evictions that have been passed by or recommended by the CDC or our governor. So building new space has slowed down or halted. We've seen some increase in vacancy rates. We've seen the trend toward remote working. So what does that mean? As you look at the screen now, we're evidence of what's happening. I'm in the office. My two partners are working remotely from home. So we have about 30%, if you use that number, of our space being utilized. It's probably a lot less. And so with this space unoccupied, 69% of the lessees paid at least part of the payment. They do have the leases, so those leases have to be worked with. And so they're reworking the amount of space that they need in the office spaces. What's interesting for locally, for suburban Chicago area, is actually seeing some activity out there. That's where the work seems to be going out to the suburbs where individuals are living, where they need less space. Chicago is still being challenged. The vacancy rates are climbing faster in the Chicagoland area. And so again, another industry where we're seeing a larger assessment of requests in the PTAB or at the circuit court cases.
Well, great. Thanks, Mike. So what Mike's talking about in terms of impact across different sectors of the market, we are now seeing reflected in some of the assessment data. So just a quick review. In Cook County, parcels are assessed every 3 years. The pinkish area is the north and northwest suburbs. That area was reassessed in 19. This year, 2020, it's the south and southwest suburbs. And then the green area, the footprint of the city, will be reassessed in 2021. And with that, you can see what the assessor's doing. So in late May, Assessor Fritz Kagi rolled out a report which is available on the assessor's website. And this is really a good tool for communicating. We would strongly advise you to take a look at this. As your taxpayers call you, especially when the bills come out and say, hey, what's going on here? The assessor has come up with his formula for adjusting the value of residential, commercial, industrial properties. So that report came out, and there's really two factors at work here on the next slide, showing how he's looking at it. So he's really looking at employment data and the impact that it's having on the economy. So the assessor is anticipating a lot of appeals. And if you own property or have seen assessment notices in the south and southwest suburbs, you are seeing these COVID-19 adjustments. And for residential properties, the data that the assessor has looked at is really a function of unemployment causing a decrease in home prices. Now, there was a Cranes article this week that really called that premise into question. And it's sort of the juxtaposition of unemployment, but a desire for people to have larger backyards and a little bit more space. That is reflected now in some increasing values and a shortage of inventory for single family homes in the suburbs. So the assessor had made a downward adjustment. It looks like the market may actually be reflecting an upward adjustment for single family homes in the suburbs. That will work itself out, but there is a bit of a conflict there. And then with respect to commercial and industrial properties, the assessor in his report really talks about it being a function of the use of cap rates. A cap rate is a tool that is used to derive value from an income stream. The higher the cap rate, the higher the imputed risk of the investment. So a fully leased in normal times downtown office building with Class A tenants is going to sell with a very low cap rate because it's a low risk investment. An empty building that has no income stream where you're speculating what future leases are going to look like, that's going to have a higher cap rate. Now, the next slide takes a look at one particular township in Cook County, Palos Township in the southwest suburbs. This is the data the assessor has developed by neighborhood. So the red reflects by neighborhood the changes in the unemployment rate in these particular neighborhoods. And then the green shows the type of adjustment that he is making in those neighborhoods to those properties. So the big one appears to be neighborhood 61, more or less right in the middle, where his data is showing about a 14 or 15% increase in unemployment. Not a 14% unemployment rate, but a change in the unemployment rate by about 14%. He then is reducing or applying a COVID-19 adjustment of 11.35%. So this is what is going on township by township in the south suburbs, and these COVID adjustments are being applied in every other township in Cook County as well. So you either will have received a notice or more likely just have gotten something on the website. If you look, you will see that there is a COVID-19 adjustment to your assessment for 2020, regardless of which township you live in, if you live in a township in Cook County. And then the last slide here really summarizes all of these adjustments. Each of these data points is available on the assessor's website. We put it together in one comprehensive document to show you in the reassessment townships what is happening. So, you know, take a look at, say, Cicero Township, you know, not a huge number of parcels, but between 19 and 20, the assessor bumped up the assessed value by 47%. So that is, that's a shocker, frankly, in my opinion, that values would have increased that much, but clearly he's got data to support that. Whereas, say, in Lamont Township, it's up less than 9%. The other factor that's worth looking at is on the far right-hand side. One thing that Assessor Kagi came into office and campaigned on is try to rebalance the relationship between the assessment burden borne by residential property and that borne by commercial and industrial. And in each of these townships, the residential share of the burden, the residential slice of the pie, is now smaller, anywhere from 10% smaller to say 1 or 2% smaller. On average, the shift has been about 7% from the commercial industrial base to the residential piece on the tax bill. So what this will mean in all likelihood is that your residential taxpayers should have a slightly smaller share of the burden, whereas the commercial industrial will have a slightly larger share. Now, does that mean that the commercial industrial will be more inclined to file appeals at the assessor, the board, PTAB, circuit court? Probably yes, because they've seen their increases, relatively speaking, greater than the residential increase. And with that, I'll turn it over. Scott, you have a question?
Yeah, it was just that we're about to shift gears and move over to a different topic area. So I was just wondering if the audience had any questions. And if not, my question for you, Eris, was going to be, what are you seeing outside of Cook County? I know you practiced in Will County and Lake County and DuPage County. What's going on outside of Cook?
Yeah, so I've spoken with a few township assessing officials, and I'll tell you what a lot of them are saying is they're saying, listen, for 2020, our job is to value the property as of January 1st, 2020. So they are not making significant changes like we're seeing in Cook County. That is not a universal phenomenon, Scott, but it is across the board more or less what we're seeing. I mean, I can tell you in Bloomingdale Township, Milton Township, they're actually applying modest increases because they're looking at the year over year change. 2019 was a reassessment quadrennial in all the suburban counties of Cook County. Of Northeast Illinois. So DuPage, Lake, Will, McHenry, et cetera. What you're now seeing is them saying, hey, as of 1/1/20, values actually clicked up a little bit. So there are no wholesale reductions. It's been fairly quiet, I would say, relatively speaking, compared to prior years in the Board of Review activity as well. So.
So there's also the issue of the timing of tax payments, I see. That's been a big issue this year.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So internally, Mike and Scott and I have been wondering what's going to happen for 2020 taxes due in 21. You all know, and you likely experienced the fact that your county may have implemented some type of a deferral or a waiver process for taxpayers to give them a little breathing room on the second installment of taxes. So I know, for example, a good example is DuPage, where on their taxes, you could apply, and then if you qualified through the county treasurer, you were able to defer the payment of your taxes by 60 days without any interest or penalty accruing. That was by application. In Cook County, the second installment was delayed from August 1 to October 1 for all taxpayers. And about 200,000 homeowners actually took advantage of that to the tune of $1.4 billion in taxes that would have been payable on August 1 that was paid on October 1 instead. Now, will we see this again? And, you know, right on cue, Assessor Pappas and Crane Chicago Business issued a press release and a story last night. And as you expect from us, we're taking stuff right off the headlines and we're providing it to you within 24 hours, ripped from the headlines. So yes, we are likely to see a deferral of both installments, March and August, up to 60 days for your 2020 taxes due in 2021. Treasurer Pappas issued the press release. It looks like from that press release, she's already been talking with County Board President Preckwinkle and many of the commissioners. So it is highly probable this will go through. That would make the March date due May 1 and the August date due October 1, just like last year. And don't be surprised if we see something like this in many of the other counties throughout northeastern Illinois that are going to be under pressure to have a similar program providing taxpayers with some relief on their 2020 tax bills.
Looks like we have a couple of questions. One is, can you send us the document ARIS references? And sure, if you could, the questioner, if you could just send us specifically which slide you were talking about, we'll absolutely will share a link. We also have another question: how might the multiplier affect the assessor's increase as it equalizes the values? Scott, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, get out your crystal ball here, Scott.
Yes, I used to actually in my lawyer career, I actually used to have participate in a pool on what the multiplier would be. And no one ever nailed it exactly. Some people came close, but not really. I think,
That's pretty wonky, don't you think, to have a pool on a multiplier?
Yeah, it's the definition of wonkiness. But the basic rule of thumb is that as assessments go down, the multiplier is going to go up. But counterbalancing that is how close the assessed values come to the percentage of fair market value based on the studies. So as long as the assessor is staying close to the 10% level of assessment for residential property and close to the 25% level of assessment for commercial and industrial property, then it's not, the multiplier is not going to go up by that much. But it's impossible to predict until we see what the sale prices are going to indicate.
And then we did have one more question, Mike or Scott. What impact will the property taxes have on the levies and the COVID-19 adjustment? I mean, to me, if the COVID-19 adjustment takes assessments down, but they are ultimately adjusted upward by perhaps a higher multiplier from the state, it could be a neutral impact in the sense of AVs go down, equalized assessed value would click things back up to where they were, maybe slightly lower. It potentially, unless you've got some sort of a rate limitation ceiling issue that you're facing, I would say that the practical application on levies and tax rates is going to be minimal at best.
Okay, why don't we move on to what proactive steps the districts can take to protect their revenue? So what we're recommending in Cook County is to get a little more active a little earlier, and that means at the board of review. Now, you're not going to be able to be involved in as many cases as you are at PTAB. It is a really focused, short-term opportunity, the time period for filing. But nevertheless, we do recommend, because there are benefits in doing so. Certainty of assessments. We're entering into multi-year agreements with these matters at the board of review. Eliminate PTAB and TOC filings through not only the 3-year deals, but we've been able to wrap up multiple years of cases that may be pending at the PTAB or at the circuit court. Again, this helps reduce refunds because there are no refunds that would occur from your settlements at the board of review. But you have to be strategic when we talked about, because again, it's a shortened time period for the intervention here. And so what we've usually done is we've worked with the districts to identify the top 25 valued properties. Then we try to target within that group 10 of the properties that are looking for, we believe, based on the history, the largest assessment reductions. And then we move on those. Eris or Scott, any thoughts on that?
You know, it's just a very, it's a time crunch, especially this year because of COVID-19. The whole assessment process was delayed between the months of March and July while people tried to figure out how to work remotely. And so now the board of review deadlines are all occurring right around Christmas time. And it's going to be an incredible time crunch for both the board of review and anybody who's practicing at the board of review.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Scott. It is, like Mike said, you need to be strategic, find the key properties that are sort of repeat offenders at PTAB or in the circuit court, and try to nip some of those in the bud. And we've been doing that for an expanding group of clients with quite a bit of success in that process.
And if anybody has any questions, just feel free to email us, and we're happy to let you know the deadlines for your various townships. PTAB, what's happening with the PTAB? Just a reminder that you're receiving the notices in which you have to file the appeals on within 60 days of receipt of the notices, but they're not paper notices in Cook County any longer, okay? Keep an eye out for those who are viewing this. For those who are not viewing this, keep an eye out for an email from Board of Review Report Server at cookcountyil.gov. That's how you're receiving your notices for your PTAB cases now. So PTAB, like the other state offices, activity was held in abeyance kind of for 60-day periods. In May, PTAB reactivated in June. And then we're going back to hearings. So you're going to start hearing from your attorneys, from us, on matters that we could resolve, you know, and try to, because there'll be settlement conferences. Those hearings are beginning in December, as well as actually full-blown hearings. They're going to be using the WebEx as opposed to Zoom or meetings, Microsoft meetings. They're using the WebEx process for doing their hearings. But PTAB is up and running again. Team, any questions on that or thoughts?
No, I just know that both of you have been doing a lot of work. It seems like PTAB shut down for a while there, and then there was a flood of notices that started coming in. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, Scott, they've definitely reactivated. I mean, they're working remotely too, the ALJs and staff, both in Springfield and Des Plaines. But I do think they have got things figured out a little bit better. And as Mike said, with the WebEx platform doing hearings, I mean, within our firm, we've had people doing bench trials in the circuit court and contested motions and everything via these various platforms, Zoom, Teams, WebEx. And it's an adjustment, but it's a way to move forward and sort of break up or avoid a bigger backlog than we would otherwise be facing.
We do have a question about the CPI. I haven't looked at it lately. Scott, have you seen, or Eris, the latest reports on the CPI?
I have not, Mike. I mean, you can check on the website of the Bureau of Labor Statistics on what it is month to month and where it's going to land in the December number as of January. but I have not been tracking it. I think just anecdotally, if you look in the newspapers, read the Wall Street Journal, inflation has been pretty mild. Even the Fed has more aggressively tried to, the Fed has this 2% target, and they said they're going to overshoot the target if possible, but it's been in the below 1% category for several months now. So, we could be looking at a December number when it's published in January that is, well below 1%.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I haven't looked at it for about 6 months, but that was exactly what I was seeing the last time I looked at the CPI.
Yeah,
It looks like one of our viewers just told us it's been running at about 1.3 for the last few months. So thank you for that quick response.
Great. Okay, Scott, I think we're talking about tax objection complaints now.
Right. These are the cases that are filed in circuit court rather than at PTAB, seeking a reduction in the assessed value of the properties. And just like at PTAB, there have been substantial changes occurring in the circuit court because of COVID-19. The courts were essentially shut down between March and July of this year. And then they started using Zoom for court hearings and some trials. My experience has been overall positive with the use of Zoom for court hearings. It's no worse than going to court. And yesterday I was participating in a Zoom conference, and I did have to wait for 30 minutes while the judge dealt with an emergency plumbing issue at his home. But in my opinion, that's no worse than having to sit through 15 probate cases while you wait for the judge to call your case. Eris and Mike, what are your thoughts on Zoom hearings in court?
Mine has been quite positive. I've done a number of Zoom statuses in Lake County, DuPage, one in Will, and it's an amazingly effective process. I think sometimes you have this highly disruptive event that hits society with a lot of negative repercussions, but there are some positive things that have come out of it, which has been this massive wholesale adoption of technology by court systems that are otherwise really rickety and old-fashioned and driven by paper and carbon copy. And when it comes to doing statuses and motions and things that are not a jury trial, these electronic media are highly effective. I think they're really cost-effective for clients and allow things to be done in a much more efficient way. So we'll see if they succeed once we get past COVID, and if these vaccines are as effective as these companies are saying they are. We'll see if these processes stay in place.
Yeah, I agree. I had one today, and the courts are probably going to be shut down to at least 2021, and then start to open up in a modest fashion.
So yeah, I mean, there's a number of other procedural changes that are being implemented, which are actually a good thing, and a use of technology by a system that's not used to using technology. Rather than doing everything by paper, the courts have implemented a system of emailing orders from the parties to the judge, and then from the judge back to the parties, so that they can expedite this system. Because right now, at the Daily Center, where all of these tax objection cases in Cook County are heard, only one judge is allowed on a floor at any time. It's kind of funny because they have a clerk sitting in an empty courtroom every day without a judge or anybody else being there. But that's just the way they've decided to handle things. Now, some of these changes that they are implementing because of COVID-19 are going to require changes to the official rules of the Cook County Circuit Court. And I'm currently sitting on the committee that is helping to draft the changes to these rules. And my big push, other than making sure that all of the procedures make sense, is to push for more information to be included in the publicly available court file. Currently, there's very little information in the tax objection complaint files. There's one document in particular that's called a section 2-50 cover sheet, and 2-50 is just the section of the rules that comes from. But it basically tells us how much of a refund the taxpayer is asking for. And because that document is not in the court file, we can't always know how much of a refund the plaintiff is asking for. So I'm just pushing for a rule change that would have that cover sheet in the file so that we could make a better determination about which cases are seeking large refunds and which cases are not. Now, the most famous tax objection complaint case that's going on right now is A.F. Moore and Associates versus Pappas. And you might have seen an article in Education Week about how a recent petition for review to the US Supreme Court was denied. Our firm actually filed the amicus brief asking the court to review this decision. And it was my first opportunity to file anything at the US Supreme Court, and it was a great experience. Just the backstory on this case for everyone's benefit. Between 2000 and 2008, a group of taxpayers filed tax objection complaints in state court alleging that their constitutional rights were violated by the Cook County assessor. And the allegation was that residential property was assessed at 10% of the fair market value rather than the 16% that was required by county ordinance. And because they owned commercial and industrial properties, these taxpayers claimed that they had paid too much taxes as a result of residential property being underassessed. So in 2018, after almost 2 decades of litigation, with those TOCs still pending in state court, a group of 7 plaintiffs asked the federal courts to step in. And initially the case was dismissed by the trial court because the Tax Injunction Act precludes federal courts from hearing state tax cases so long as there is a plain, speedy, and efficient remedy available under state law. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals reversed that decision and said that the plaintiffs could move forward in federal courts because there wasn't a plain, speedy, and efficient remedy under state law. And that decision was actually authored by Amy Coney Barrett, and Judge Barrett included that case in her paperwork that was submitted to the US Senate as one of the cases she was most proud of. When we filed our amicus brief with the US Supreme Court asking them to take up the case, we were hoping that the Supreme Court would review it because we felt there were several flaws in the decision. Most notably, to my mind, is that the Seventh Circuit was interpreting state law when it probably should have been the Illinois Supreme Court that was interpreting state law. But earlier this week, with Amy Coney Barrett abstaining, the US Supreme Court refused to hear the case, and so the case will proceed in the trial court. Now, the last thing I wanted to address is another form of circuit court case, which is the tax rate objection case. These are lawsuits that are filed against the county treasurer, but really they are naming alleged wrongful actions by the school districts in the formation of their levy or the management of their funds. Earlier this week, I was appearing before the First District Illinois Appellate Court on the issue of working cash fund bonds. Our DuPage County clients probably remember that back in 2017, the Second District Appellate Court ruled in favor of the school districts on this issue. Now, objectors have raised the same arguments against Cook County school districts. And the issue is basically whether the working cash fund bonds were illegally issued because the bond proceeds were eventually transferred out of the working cash fund to pay for capital expenditures rather than being kept in the working cash fund. Because there's such a good decision out of the Second District, we're hopeful that the First District Appellate Court follows suit and rules in favor of the school districts. I mentioned earlier that there are going to be changes to the circuit court rules in Cook County. The same thing is true for tax rate objections. And in the future, the most important change you're likely to see is that instead of receiving notice of these tax rate objections through the US mail, you'll probably receive them by email to the address on file with the county clerk's office. Then the last thing has to do with excess accumulation objections. These are a pretty widespread and common objection, which alleges that the fund balances of a school district are too large compared to their expenditures. And this particular issue primarily affects our clients in DuPage, Will, and Lake counties. There is a new attorney that's leading up these objections, and he has a different interpretation of the law, and he's also less inclined to negotiate on these particular matters. Normally in the past, when we have spoken about excess accumulation objections, we were talking about 2.5 times. We were talking about the fund balances exceeding the average expenditures by more than 2.5 times. This new attorney reads the law to say that it's really 2 to 3 times the average annual expenditures. And so anything over 2 is problematic when you're talking about the ratio. There's also an issue with him and the manner in which that he is calculating the fund balances. In the past, we had always used the revenue and expenditure sheet from your AFR to look at what the fund balance was. He has recently started using the assets and liabilities page and including things that we don't think should necessarily be included in the calculation of the fund balance. So it's the best advice for you going forward is don't rely on this 2.5 to 1 rule. Instead, if your fund balances are getting close to 2, take steps to try to avoid a rate objection by not levying as much or increasing your expenditures out of that fund. But Eris or Mike, anything to add on that?
Not really. I think that's, sort of the next frontier on the tax rate objection litigation, Scott, is what is the correct source for the fund balance information, because this is a new view of how it should be done, and it is causing these multipliers to appear to be higher than we would normally consider them as problematic. So
Yeah, just one point, we're going through a lot of material here. There was a question about how you could, re-listen to this session. You simply go to our website, you go to the K-12 section of our website, you go to events, and we'll be rebroadcasting the presentations from the school law conference and our other presentations.
And when we talk about excess accumulation, many of you are familiar with what are known as the Miller ratios. That's the Central Illinois Public Service v. Miller. That's a 1967-ish Illinois Supreme Court decision that regurgitated a lot of the existing law and that people rely on for purposes of developing expenditure multipliers. So it is the Miller ratio we're talking about.
Great. Well, let's shift gears and move over to economic development.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Mike talked about some of the repercussions and these earthquakes that are happening in various sectors of the real estate market. And I think what that is going to lead to, especially with retail and hospitality taking the biggest hit, you just have to look around and see what's happening at malls, what's happening with hotels, in food and beverage industry. I think there's going to be, from your local municipalities, an increased reliance on economic development incentives. So primarily, we're talking about TIF districts and we're talking about property tax abatement. So I want to take a few minutes to just get this on your radar and give you some tools to evaluate and respond. So as far as the big super regional malls, many of them now are having TIF districts in place. So Northbrook Court on Lake Cook Road, the Macy's store either was recently or has been completely demolished. They're putting up a 300+ unit apartment building, creating a TIF district at that mall. Fox Valley Mall in Aurora on the west side of Route 59, that is that's a mall with 4 anchors, 3 of which are Sears, Penny's, and Carson's. That is recently in a mall. Stratford Square in Bloomingdale put into a TIF district. Hawthorne Mall is in the process of getting put into a TIF district in Vernon Hills. And then the fashion outlets of Chicago and Rosemont, if you are up and down 294 at all, right by O'Hare, you'll see that. That, like many developments in Rosemont, is in a TIF district. So we're seeing more and more TIF districts rolled out to address some of the issues that Mike and Scott talked about, which is people being less inclined to shop in these big box stores, the massive number of bankruptcies that we're seeing, and the presence of COVID-19 and how that's fundamentally changing how people shop. Now, not all malls are going into TIF districts, though. You still have some of these really successful ones like Woodfield and Oak Brook and Orland Square and let's stop at that point where you have no TIF district yet. Now, I will tell you at Orland Square a couple years ago when the Carsons left, the village said, let's do a tax abatement, not a TIF. And all the taxing bodies agreed. They had a Von Mauer that wanted to move in, and Von Mauer took the space. And so no TIF was necessary, but a 10-year tax abatement was agreed upon and is benefiting Von Mauer to get them in that space. Now, North Riverside Mall is a different animal. I wouldn't put it in the category of Woodfield, Old Orchard, or Oak Brook. There is no TIF district there yet, but we'll see what happens. These malls to date have not had TIFs put in place. So when you get that notice of a joint review board, or you read in the notes or the minutes of the village board, hey, we want to do a TIF district or an abatement, what are the things you should be thinking about? And how to talk about this stuff with your community, because talking about this in open session can be a healthy process, both in terms of keeping the board informed, but just letting your local media know that, hey, you're aware of this, so the village knows you're aware of it. The biggest difference is duration. An abatement is going to be a 10-year commitment, whereas a TIF district by statute is 23 years, and it's not unusual to see them extended up to 35 years by action of the General Assembly. The maximum amount for all taxing bodies with an abatement is $4 million, whereas with a TIF, it's really unlimited. And I've seen a couple TIFs lately where the budgets are over $200 million for significant public improvements and infrastructure. Whether it's an abatement or a TIF, your input early and often is key. The municipality should know that you're watching, that you're aware, that you know this is going to have an impact. You should run the numbers yourself to see what the PTEL implications are going to be. Under the limiting rate formula, the EAV that's within the TIF, the incremental EAV, is taken out of the denominator. That will boost your tax rate over time and shift the tax burden onto others. Part of your rate, and this is my last point, is that a TIF district causes a tax increase with a shift. Part of your rate will reflect dollars that you don't get and that go into the TIF increment. So be aware of that. Don't be afraid to talk about it. I guarantee you the municipality will not be talking about it. And then the one more topic we want to cover today, and this is something that's pure COVID-19, are the multiple eviction moratoriums that have been rolled out by various levels of government. The biggest, most sweeping one is the Centers for Disease Control, sort of an unlikely agency to wade into the residential real estate market, but they issued a moratorium in early September that runs through the end of this year that basically says if you meet a certain income threshold, it's $99,000 a year for an individual, $198,000 if people file jointly, and there's certain other criteria. If you've had an impact from COVID, you cannot be evicted unless you're engaging in a criminal activity or you're damaging the property, et cetera. So the state of Illinois has a moratorium in place through December 12th. The city of Chicago has a moratorium. Those two are both borrowing heavily from what the CDC has done in terms of income levels. The city of Chicago makes the 5-day waiting period, the notice period, a 12-day notice period, requires the landlord to affirmatively negotiate with the tenant. If that doesn't happen, that's an automatic affirmative defense for the tenant in any eviction proceedings. Now, these moratoria are going to have implications for tenants, for landlords, and school districts. For tenants, you've got people who are frozen in place potentially. They're not going to move under the circumstances. They may have nowhere to go other than becoming homeless, and that's one of the goals of these moratorium is to avoid people either becoming homeless or moving into a very densely residential situation, say with family or friends, where the likelihood of COVID and its airborne nature, it could be more dangerous. Landlords, they may not be getting paid. The tenants are still under all three of these moratoria required to pay what they can. Partial payments will be accepted. The ultimate rent amount is still due. It's just deferred for a period of time if that's what is worked out between landlord and tenant. And then with school districts, I think the one thing that I'm concerned about would be the possibility of landlords who are simply not getting paid by a large number of tenants, they may decide, hey, you know, I can't pay my own taxes, and they might roll the dice in terms of letting their property drift into the annual sale or the scavenger sale that every county treasurer holds. So that's a bit of a speculative impact, but I think if this drags on much longer, it is a possibility. So that's what I wanted to cover on the eviction moratorium. And any other questions, guys?
Yeah, there's two questions. So
Yeah.
let me hit the first one. The second one has to do with TIFs, but let's do the first one. And this has been a common practice in the past. Scott, maybe you could speak as to whether or not you've seen any rate objections on this or any thoughts. But we are told by administration that boards should levy to the max or we lose out of revenue in future years, and it's compounded. Any thoughts on that, gang?
Yeah, that gets into the property tax extension limitation law. And Eris, please feel free to jump in here at any point in time. But basically, you can levy, your levy can increase by the rate of CPI up to 5% for the largest levy of the past 3 years. So if you do not levy up to the maximum this year, you could still revert back to the prior year's levy for your growth, but the difference will be lost. So there is some incremental loss that can occur with the levies, but it's not great. But I don't know, Eris, if you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there are implications for not availing yourself of the full, say, CPI increase that you would get on the prior year, or taking advantage of new property that becomes available either through new construction, the expiration of a TIF district, a formerly exempt property coming back on the tax rolls. These are sort of one-time opportunities. So if you don't levy in such a way that gets the full CPI and the full value of your new property, you do lose out on that in the future. So if the nature of your levy is such that you are not going to go for the maximum available of CPI and new property, whatever you're leaving on the table, so to speak, using that metaphor, will compound over time, but not to your benefit. It'll compound in what you won't be getting in the future. So that's why, you know, I think with most school districts, there are projections made. There's communication with the public, with board members to talk about these phenomena in order to make sure everybody knows what the consequences of not levying the full amount of CPI or capturing all your new property in any given year.
Right. I guess what I was trying to say earlier is that what's compounding is the difference between the maximum that you could have levied and what you actually levied. So the amount of the loss is that difference between the two.
That's correct. Yep.
Yeah, and one of our participants actually, recommended what we're talking about, but also said there could be an abatement that can be done. There's nothing to prevent an abatement from occurring. So
that is true. That is true as a way to sort of give your taxpayers a bit of a break through that process. Yes.
Yeah.
Once again, our viewers are just as smart as we are.
Eris, this final question has to do with TIF. I don't know if we have an answer because it's a little early in the process, but that is before the evidence-based funding formula, it was relatively easy to determine the lost GSA, I believe referred to general state aid due to TIF. How do you do that under the new funding formula? I don't know if we have an answer for that.
Yeah, I don't have an answer for that one. That whoever is asking this, okay, I see who it is. Feel free to give me a call. We can talk it through, but off the top of my head, I don't have an answer for you on this one.
Yep. Okay, I think we're near the end of our time. Let me just see. Looks like we had
anything else. Did I see another question?
Looks like it came in. Would it be unethical to just levy as much as you plan, and if you eventually lose a case, pay back probably at a discount? Just a thought. I have no experience with thinking that way. Yeah, we probably would not be advising you to do that.
I think what the question is getting at, do you view a rate objection as a cost of doing business with respect to how you levy? So would you potentially levy more knowing that it might draw a rate objection, keeping in mind that the reality of the rate objection is not going to be a refund to all taxpayers. It's only going to be a refund to those who participate in the rate objection And even then, it's not going to be at 100%. So certainly that is a mindset that some people take when they levy, that they view the rate objection as a cost of doing business, and that they are willing to, take that calculated risk that they might have to send some of those dollars back 5 or 10 years from now with interest, certainly.
Yeah, the only caveat I would add to that is that definitely applies to what we would consider the nuisance rate objections. But if you have a big rate objection where they're going to object to your entire levy, and they have a strong case, for example, your fund balances are 5 times what your average annual expenditures are, then it's probably not a good idea to just take the rate objection. It's better to avoid the rate objection in that situation.
Yeah. Hey, we're at 1 o'clock, and Mike and Scott and the entire firm want to thank you for joining us for the past hour. We are grateful that you tune into these webinars. We appreciate the opportunity to share information with you. And we hope we'll see you all on December 3rd and then on the 10th, and some of the programming we've got in the pipeline talking about the transition to a Biden administration. We wish you good health and a happy Thanksgiving, and we'll be seeing everybody soon. Take care, folks.